So good morning, everyone. Welcome to Saturday Matters. I can see by the crowd that you all are anticipating a friendly, happy, cheerful, sunny outlook on our national politics. And so Barry Keene, whose name is actually spelled with 3 E's, sorry about that, it's my fault. But you all know who he is anyway, and here he is.
I've been told some people are reluctant to attend because my presentations are too negative. Well, I'll be blunt. Denial, avoidance, and complacency are the very attitudes that got us into the trouble we find ourselves in. I hope you'll bear with me this morning. What I'll be covering would have been relevant to classes that I once taught. With one big exception, it's far more relevant today than it was then. There's a growing concern that we're confronted with a power-obsessed monster. An unchained Leviathan seeking absolute control over our lives. Our pushback to that is premised on the mistaken perception that this phenomenon is new and exceptional. In fact, it dates back to well before the origins of the American Republic. What practical difference does that disparity in understanding make? It means that we underestimate what is at stake. And still, I believe that's true throughout the general populace. And we therefore fall short of committing the level of sacrifice needed to subdue a monster. And it means that the strategy undertaken is designed without reference to the landscape of the battlefield. So my purpose this morning is to lay a foundation for a more reliable and nuanced basis for grasping our situation. The 17th century English philosopher Thomas Hobbes is now widely regarded as one of a handful of truly great political philosophers whose masterwork, Leviathan, rivals in significance the political writings of Plato, Aristotle, Locke, Rousseau, Kant, Voltaire, and Rawls, to which I would add the brilliant young political polymath James Madison. If Hobbes were writing it today instead of Leviathan, it would be entitled Trump. In any event, he wrote his famous book in the wake of an incredibly bloody civil war in England. Hobbes believed that humans in nature were so motivated by self-preservation that without some dominant authority, a perpetual state of war would prevail. Every person would fear violence and death from every other person. Life would be, he said famously, 5 famous words: solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. For him, the only way was for citizens to relinquish their freedom in return for the security provided by a hopefully benevolent sovereign. Except for the hopefully benevolent part, isn't that where we are today? We have a rogue president subject in theory to the constraints of what was regarded as an exceptional constitutional foundation for a remarkably sustainable republic. We thought our Leviathan was chained, but is he? Those who see Trump as a threat to democracy comfort themselves with the belief that limits exist that will hold him in check. They haven't, and by themselves they won't. Let's take a look. In 2020, facing presidential defeat, without regard for legal constraints, Trump asked whether declaring a rigged election, which he could have done, declaring it a rigged election, he could order seizure of the ballot boxes. He was told it was physically impossible without troops on the ground. Today, declaring a fraud emergency in Los Angeles, tomorrow in Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, or anywhere, he would have those troops to seize the ballot boxes. So if you take comfort in the polls that show a huge Republican defeat in the 2026 midterms, you better start considering that there might not be any midterms. That's what's truly important about Trump's recent takeover of California's National Guard. And most Americans and journalists don't realize that fact. They don't talk about it. So how can we determine what is really going on? I have to resort to what I know. John Madden. Does anybody remember John Madden?
Yeah, sure.
He was a well-respected professional football coach, a commentator, and a strategist capable of explaining well beyond the football rules what was really going on that was important. Madden would have laughed at the notion that people who had a football rule book, or even a constitution, really understood the game. I tell you with certainty that even those extremely familiar with the words of the Constitution probably do not understand it enough to know what is really going on. To really know it is to know its meaning, which is a product of historical significance, the effect of later amendments, their historical significance, the impacts of judicial interpretation, the twists of usage, custom, practice, and political acceptance. Those are the kinds of things that make a living constitution. It also necessitates knowledge and acknowledgement of its shortcomings. So to grasp what is really going on, we need to understand both the meaning of the Constitution and the nature of its failures. The scope of presidential power was an issue from the very beginning. Today, on the edge of tumbling into authoritarianism, which is where we are, it is the issue. In the 18th century, the world was coming to grips with the concept that a centuries-old monarchical tradition could be replaced by something else. For example, perhaps by a group of the king's ministers collectively sharing the sovereign power. You know about Magna Carta, and I won't go into the history of that. Then portions of that group could be assigned certain governance functions. Other portions, other functions. So there was discussion of a separation of powers long before it became part of the American Constitution. A little bit of history, because the American story is important. In the English Americas were a small number of educated colonials. Ironically, many were beneficiaries of a slave economy. They were mostly from prosperous New England, Pennsylvania, and the South, where colleges were being formed. So European political philosophers like Mills, Voltaire, Locke, the ones I've mentioned, and Montesquieu, were emulated by people like Franklin, Adams, Hamilton, Jefferson, and especially, as I've also mentioned, a prodigious youngster in his college teens and early 20s named James Madison. They knew of historic examples of experimentation with power-sharing governance in Athens, Rome, Switzerland, and gradually, but with interruptions in their own England. Remember, they were English. At Philadelphia in 1787, colonial delegates gathered to improve their defective cooperative relationship embodied in the Articles of Confederation. Their motives varied depending on where they came from, nearly half motivated by a desire to protect their property of enslaved humans. Another half having mixed emotions, only mixed emotions about the slaveholding economy. And a noble few, like Quakers, for example, treating the enslavement of humans as a criminal abomination. Well, that conflict was papered over in a compromise that proved only temporary, evolving into, as you know, a cataclysmic civil war. Nonetheless, the 1789 Constitution reflected the most advanced 18th century thinking about how to structurally design a viable, stable, and balanced government. Ponder that, because it proved globally earth-shaking in the centuries that followed. It was only later that a further compromise to the structural Constitution added 10 amendments concerning the balance between the governmental powers allocated in the 1789 Constitution and the rights of the people. Unlike the structured allocation of powers, I'm making a distinction now between the structured allocation and the individual rights allocation. Under the structural allocation, you had the federal government versus the state governments, and the federal government, the federal branches versus each of the other two branches. The Bill of Rights was different. It was about government versus individual citizens. It empowered people to stand up against all government, each of the federal branches, and eventually, as the lawyers know, by judicial incorporation, the states. Executive power was vested in a president, and that was a highly centralized idea, necessary, they thought, in order to permit coherent and decisive federal policies. But it also tended to tempt future predatory presidents to engage in unconstitutional or federal statutory violations. So rules that give power to good presidents also empower bad ones. It's a difficult balancing act. What the Constitution intended with respect to federal empowerment isn't clear. Possibly because the framers didn't have a clear sense of the newly conceived office they were creating. Remember, they had dealt with the king. And now were they creating an executive officer? Would it be another king? What would it be? Madison's chief contribution in designing the new government, described by some as his genius, was not in dividing sovereign power among branches. As mentioned, that was nothing new. But deliberately building in conflict between the divisions, pitting the branches against each other, called checks and balances, that was inconceivably new. It was assumed each branch would push hard against the others to maximize its role and power. And that's why a president's lawfully bounded pushing was anticipated. But ask yourselves, today, do you see the Supreme Court and the Congress doing their share of pushing? You're beginning to see the problem. Clearly not. What did not occur to the framers before parties were born was that presidents, members of Congress, and the majority of state governments might all line up on the same side because of party affiliation, weakening the combative assumption that underlied Madison's checks and balances formulation. Now, in that battle among the branches and between the federal government and the states, ambiguities would be resolved in one of two ways. And I'll talk about that. But first, let me tell you this. Washington, Franklin, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison expressly worried about the durability of the Republic, each almost predicting its termination by a threat, not from without, but from within, and by some clever opportunist without scruples, a demagogue exactly like Trump. So that's where we are, what they predicted. The combative structural arrangement Madison designed left ample room, even incentive, for an overreaching presidential power thrust by some future megalomaniac like Donald Trump. The framers did not answer a number of unresolved questions about the exact power. Why? Because they probably had enough trouble agreeing on a framework for government without presuming enough political wisdom to settle every issue that might come up in a dynamic set of relationships. Relationships that were actually designed to produce conflict. Madison's checks and balances. To the American Constitution, after designating and organizing the component parts, the branches of our federal government, goes on to do two more things. It empowers those components, sometimes specifically by enumerated powers, sometimes implicitly to allow flexibility to deal with unforeseeable situations. So they had to leave some ambiguities. They couldn't tell exactly what ought to be done by future governments because they didn't know what future governments would be faced with. And those ambiguities would be resolved, as I mentioned, in one of two ways. Thank you. Politically, by compromise between and among the branches, or judicially by an independent system of courts. So officials of good character would work it out, or if they got stuck, the courts would work it out. So the power boundaries that were being fought over, that are being fought over today, were never firm. And that was one opening, seemingly an unavoidable one, for Trump to push his authority. However, it later was irresponsibly enlarged by an avoidable one, where you had unenumerated powers. Remember, they couldn't enumerate all of them because they didn't know what was going to happen. Where you had the unenumerated powers ostensibly inherent. President, you take care of the executive. Rather than work out the requisite compromises, which was a politically costly process, it became easier to isolate difficult problems and characterize them as exceptions, even emergencies, and treat them by default as outside the conventional constitutional provisions, at least to the degree the courts would allow. And in the case of the real or few challenges confronting a chief executive, they tolerated a lot. So much, it not only displaced increasing segments of the constitutional understanding, it resulted in, unknown to most Americans, mark these words, please, a parallel legal regime that allows the president to sidestep many of the constraints that would otherwise have applied. So the moment the president declares a national emergency, a decision that seems entirely within his discretion, more than 100 special provisions become available to him. While many of these trigger reasonable responses to genuine emergencies, some appear dangerously suited to a leader bent on amassing or retaining power. For instance, the president can, with a flick of his pen, activate laws allowing him to shut down electronic communications inside the United States. What we're talking about is email, bank statements, online news. He could shut all of that down. Other powers are available even without a declaration of emergency, including, as we've just experienced, laws that allow the president to deploy troops inside the country to subdue domestic unrest or to try to seize ballot boxes. Well, I could spend a week or a year or more elaborating to your horror on this. In a 2019 Saturday presentation when Trump was just getting started with his overreach, I did elaborate, and I provided copies of that to be made available at the end of this meeting. I don't have to tell you, in the last 5 months we've felt an unremitting series of shocks. Executive orders gutting civil rights and constitutional protections. A man with a chainsaw trying to hollow out the federal government. Deliberately brutal deportations. People snatched off the streets and caused to disappear in unmarked cars. Legal attacks on universities and law firms. We're living in kind of a bubble here. We're not experiencing these things, but they're happening outside. Among many more transparently lawless acts he's undertaken through the daily use of executive orders, are the massive tariff impositions depriving Congress of its Article 2 constitutional control of the public treasury. Freezing congressionally required program spending, emptying through unlawful firing entire federal agencies created by congressional statute, attempting to take away a right to citizenship that is written with total clarity into the Constitution. So it tells us in no uncertain terms that this administration has no intention of respecting the law or the Constitution. Trump seems intent on replacing it with a dictatorship. Combating that outcome demands that we consider how he plans to do it. Will he do it with a brazenly obvious, overwhelming direct assault, or will he engage in more insidious, less visibly disruptive means? In my last presentation, Thinking the Unthinkable, I addressed the consequences of Trump's directly crossing the red line, which he might do any day now, overturning the rule of law by clearly refusing to obey an order of the Supreme Court. And that postulated that in the absence of judicial protection, the shield provided by overwhelming judicial rejection of Trump's offensive, the ultimate fallback for our survival would be reliance on the Army. But for that reliance, the Army would have to disobey presidential orders, notwithstanding the Constitution's making him its commander-in-chief. This scenario, though dramatic, is not fantasy. I hope you appreciate by now that in life what you thought yesterday could not happen has happened. Marines in the streets of Los Angeles, currently okayed by the courts. Unfortunately, though, dictatorship may also occur, in fact, may already be occurring, as I mentioned, more gradually and insidiously through the exploitation of perfectly legal means. Trump is testing the limits of power at every turn, bending, not visibly breaking the Constitution to achieve dominance. And bending is more my focus today. The Constitution's Article 1 grants the power of the purse, the right to tax and spend exclusively to Congress. Yet this president has seized that power by imposing a sales tax in the form of tariffs on the American people. By divesting Congress, there is no public representation in that decision by the president. Now, something should be sounding familiar in your minds. Remember the famous revolutionary cry, no taxation without representation? Well, that's what we have. And the courts so far cannot stop it. In pursuit of his desire to become an authoritarian ruler, Donald Trump, lawbreaker and pardoner of violently traitorous lawbreakers, has distorted the structural power arrangement in the original Constitution. And in favoring and empowering further his executive branch in accumulating power, he's gone on to trample the most important individual rights or subsequently added to that original Constitution, the Bill of Rights. The question about a unitary executive blowing away the agencies created by law to administer programs is one of the hottest topics today, 2025. It's a pathway to elbowing out congressional participation. That participation that is still most reflective of popular will, and increasing the executive's authority to remove government officials at will, including, by the way, special prosecutors. It distorts the system of checks and balances. It unshackles the Leviathan. Other disputes deal with presidential authority over foreign affairs and national security, including the war power about to be used in an Iranian attack. An attack not even debated in Congress, which has theoretically at least the war power. Well, I won't get into some of those tangled questions directly, except in thinking about the power of presidents to declare emergencies and take action without the express authority of Congress. Why is that so important? Because executive orders pursuant to emergency powers right at this moment are the key contributor to Trump's abusive expansion of authority. Constitutional law, if the system holds, prevents a president from invading the powers of other branches or ignoring restrictions that the Bill of Rights places on all governmental powers. Do courts, even if not swept away, have the will and political strength to push him back? It's questionable after recent Supreme Court decisions on executive privilege, immunity from damages, limits on criminal prosecution, and the shameless dancing they've been doing to avoid that one firm decision that would produce the feared red line crossing. Now, it's not just the courts, but Congress also has a responsibility to push back. It has the power of the purse, congressional investigations, and ultimately the power of impeachment. The first section of the Constitution, called Article 1, deliberately called Article 1, deals with Congress, thought to be more important than the presidency. And as I mentioned, there are enumerated powers and inherent powers identified by the judicial branch under Article 1's necessary and proper clause. Important to remember, the necessary and proper clause is what gives Congress the power to do things beyond the very specific powers that they've been given. Judicial powers are set forth in Article 3 of the Constitution. But the real power of the judiciary is set forth in Marbury versus Madison, which described the inherent power to declare government acts, including presidential actions, unconstitutional. Article 2, the President's article, deliberately put in second place, opens with the ultra-significant statement that the executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States. That's a quote. And it's called the vesting clause. And the vesting clause can be read in a couple of ways, but you know who Supreme Court, this current Supreme Court is. The words can be read as merely descriptive. Hey, President, you get to do the executive powers, things that are normally considered executive powers. Or it can be read as an ultra-powerful grant of power. And you can see the opening it gives Trump. The executive power includes this massive ability to do things that are not enumerated in the Constitution. And the Supreme Court, which way are they going to go? You know which way they're going to go. So you can see with the opening it gives Trump to unbalance the three branches, to increasingly take over everything. And that's another real threat without crossing the red line. Meanwhile, a lot of orange and yellow lines are being crossed. Section 2 and 3 of the Congress's Article 1. Now, these are sections, not articles. Sections 2 and 3 describe certain presidential powers. And by the time you're through, you realize that the separation of powers is a kind of myth. The checks and balances holds, but the separation of powers is kind of a myth. For example, the president is made commander-in-chief of the military, even though, as enumerated in theory, only Congress can declare war. He can make treaties, but only subject to Senate approval. He can issue pardons, which unfortunately is an absolute power, too bad, for offenses against the United States. And for Trump, it's an invitation to wealth through bribery. Like the expansive congressional necessary and proper clause, you can do what's enumerated, but beyond that, you can do anything that's necessary and proper. That's what Congress has. The president has something called a take care clause. He's generally directed to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Which raises an important question. Does that duty imposed by implication give a president expansive powers to carry it out? Trump, and again, the Supreme Court will think so. And that's another open-ended path to total control, yet it's fully within existing law. By common agreement, a president's powers are at its peak in the area of foreign affairs. But Congress also has foreign affairs powers. The courts have tried to stay out of interbranch conflicts, but when they feel compelled to intervene, it almost always favors presidential expansion. There's even more elasticity, obviously, because the fearful and compliant current Supreme Court does not want a red line constitutional crisis, which means Trump, thanks to Alioto and Thomas and Kavanaugh and some of the others, will win issues. For example, like the deportation without due process contest. Article 1, Section 7, Clause 2 is a so-called presentment clause. I won't spend a lot of time on that. It's just provides the veto power of the president and the responsive override power given Congress. But I just want to mention it because any Trump-signed piece of legislation today, given the current Senate makeup, cannot be overridden, which underscores the relative legislative powerlessness of any political opponents, meaning congressional pushback to Trump. Trump, seeking maximum control, exploits the constitutional puzzles that remain. Here are some questions. Does the president have the power to abrogate treaties approved by Congress? What about abrogating executive agreements like the one with Iran or international climate promises? What military actions can his emotionally unstable Secretary of Defense order? Are there limits on his power to fire high-level officials, even without reason? What inherent emergency powers, ones not enacted by Congress, does he have? Notice two things: the number of places where the president can push and is, and the invitation it gives the judiciary to involve itself in refereeing questions about presidential boundaries. If you add up Trump's successful power pushing on these questions and add in his attacks on the press, on the legal profession, on due process, it's very hard to distinguish from the powers exercised by dictators worldwide. Trump has used his growing authority to violate several of the 10 amendments in our Bill of Rights. It's so noticeable and reported and widespread that I didn't want to spend a lot of time where he slips on the tripwire in the Bill of Rights. But let's look at some of the rights that he has pretty much erased, and I'll cover them very briefly. Seizures and imprisonment without warrants by ICE and Homeland Security brazenly violate the due process requirements of the Fourth Amendment. There's no question about it. And the courts are kind of hesitating and dancing. They don't want to provide that red line for him to cross. The First Amendment is maybe the most important. It protects freedom of speech, among other things. And it hasn't stopped Trump from violating it in so many ways, by hectoring the media, universities and their students, federal employees, lawyers, even members of Congress. I may be the only senator who hasn't been thrown down and handcuffed. Sorry, that was supposed to be a joke. So he does it by executive orders, by filing costly, meritless lawsuits, and by sicking his Justice Department on those people. He doesn't tolerate any criticism. Okay, so you got the First and the Fourth Amendment that he's violated. The Sixth Amendment's right to counsel hasn't prevented Trump's unprocessed deportations, or barring federal contracts, or barring from federal contracts disfavored law firms that dare to represent his critics. Sending detainees to black hole foreign prisons without due process, sometimes against the judge's order, hardly honors the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. Nor does imposing the Hobson's choice of either deporting American children or ripping them from immigrant parents. Then there's the truly disgraceful corruption taking place in plain sight, the crypto coins, encouraging bribery from those seeking favorable government treatment. unbelievably including foreign governments, patently violating Article 2's emoluments clause. And I won't talk about the well-reported $400 billion foreign aircraft debacle. And those are but a few examples of how he has enriched himself and his family. Almost utterly beyond belief, on January 6th, President Trump's mob seized the American Capitol. Equally incredibly, he used this constitutional pardon power to release the thugs who staged it. All within the rule of law. We'll be talking more about the rule of war, I'm afraid, in coming weeks. Now, it's true the federal courts have been strong in resisting as best they can a rapidly dropping avalanche of Trump's efforts to rule dictatorially. The Supreme Court is not. Fearful of the red line crossing by a defiant president, it's in constant retreat, with some justices seemingly even in alliance with the president's most brazen efforts. Whether or not he winds up feeling a need for direct defiance, a dramatic upending of the rule of law, his lawfully allowable inroads are gaining speed. There's no way I can or have to magnify the threat. Except one. Conservative advocates are just 6 states short of reaching the constitutional required 34-state goal for another constitutional convention, a new one. The unknowns surrounding a constitutional convention pose a very unacceptable risk, particularly in the current polarized political climate. Too few Americans are aware that a constitutional amendment can be called, let alone that there would be no check on its scope, and further that the process to call one is well underway, and it's being underwritten by some of the nation's richest individuals, and there are plenty of them. Why is that happening now? There have been some changes that materially enhance what has been a long-time threat, a previous threat. Foremost, you have a supportive president now. You didn't before. You have looser restrictions on campaign fundraising and spending. You didn't have United Citizens before. You have a vigorously mobilized far right. MAGA didn't exist before. You have partisan polarization, and you have, as I mentioned, an increased number of millionaires, billionaires. I'll sum up. You can say, thank God, I'll sum up. Briefly by saying unreservedly that we're a nation whose very identity is an extreme risk. We and all our friends and offspring will be affected. If the threat is realized, the press will be stifled, university education will be inaccessible, scientific research will approach a standstill, people of low and average wealth, and those struggling, disabled, or just different will suffer at the hands of politically favored oligarchs. And some ordinary people just like us will be carted off indiscriminately without due process. The Constitutional Convention threat and the Supreme Court's yielding the red line may not elevate widespread fears, but the daily grinding away of our rights that you're observing within the somewhat faltering legal system simply can't be overlooked without grave risk. This morning, I know I haven't eased your concerns, far from it. But as a necessary first step, I hope I've enhanced your perceptions of their origins and the magnitude. Because it's still flying under the radar of most Americans. I see no easy solutions. We let it happen. We let it happen. If its increasing seizure of power doesn't produce a physical uprising, it may take overwhelming fear of an imminent one that will get the remaining power holders to finally act. Who are these remaining power holders? The Republican senators and the congressmen, the Supreme Court, the business titans, and all the respected others who've been in shameful hiding. The growing level of demonstrations could convey, it would have to be in time, the needed degree of urgency to move that ship of fools, because that's what they are. But I wouldn't bet on it. Thank you.
I can try to speak. Who is pulling Trump's strings? He is not an intelligent man. He may be devious, and he knows how to work people, but I can't understand how he can ignore the Constitution and turn around and use it against us, and he is, when we can't stop him doing something. There has to be somebody pulling his strings. He doesn't even know what he's signing half the time.
But why do you think he needs someone to tell him to grab power? He's been good at that all his life. He's tried to be. So I don't quite know the answer to that.
If someone has recognized his abilities, I thought it was Putin for a while, trying to unscrew.
Well, that's a theory that people like Putin are pulling his strings, but at least they're giving him some goal, someone to emulate.
It's hard to know how to phrase this sort of very complicated issue. I'm thinking about the fact that you're really concerned about the population not paying attention, not being aware, and not understanding really what's going on. So I'm not going to ask you what you think can motivate everybody, but I'd like to know if you can cite in history, even fairly recent history, where a nation that had representative government like we do and trusted those elected officials to have their interests at heart, has the population successfully done anything to stop its fall into anarchy or despotism? Have they been able to?
You mean some positive example, despite the fact that their democracy was crumbling, that someone intervened?
Well, the population in general. I mean, if your representative people in government are not doing the job you would want them to do to stop somebody like Trump. I mean, let's think of Germany, or there have been plenty of occasions in Britain too. When does it happen that the people are successful in preventing that?
I actually think that we ended the U.S. involvement in Vietnam sooner than it would have been by massive demonstrations. You might or might not agree, but I stick my nose in.
No, I agree.
That took so many years and so many people died. We don't want to have to wait that long.
Exactly, but I don't think, I think we're looking at, well, anyway, this is not my talk.
There are no easy solutions. I could look back in history and we can look at Athens. They voted themselves out of democracy. And despite the fact of their leadership trying to prevent it, it happened. So that's not a good example. That's a bad example. The Roman Senate assassinated Caesar. That's an example, but that didn't work either because another Caesar took over. So there aren't very many good examples. Maybe the Vietnam one is the closest to it. I don't know. Really?
You've very clearly presented in some detail the threats to democracy or to our freedom in this country. But I see another evil on the horizon, and that is that we have a racial issue here. Many other countries who have been through revolutions, they have not had the cultural diversity that we have here. But hidden behind all this is the issue of race and white supremacy, which I think is a very big agenda item in Trump's grab for power. And we're going to see some things that have not been seen before. So it's not just looking to dethrone a king, it's also to defend ourselves against what might be elimination of large numbers of people in this country. The Nazi kind of approach. I wonder if you have any comments about that.
It's something I worry about very much. And I try to wedge it into the thinking this morning by talking about the colonials who very dramatically depended on the slaveholding economy. Race was very much the issue from the very beginning of this country. And they set up the original Constitution to protect slavery. And it was only later that that was modified. So I'm very concerned with exactly what you said, that they're going to start picking on, they were already picking on vulnerable people. I mean, people who may have broken the law, come over as immigrants unlawfully, but they're easy pickings for this administration. So we're seeing that already, and we're going to see more of it, I'm afraid. Race is going to be something that he's going to take advantage of, the racial differences.
May I say something? Barry, you mentioned very early in your talk that we're not seeing the sufficient sacrifices needed to oppose what's going on. Do you have in mind what those sacrifices look like?
Good question.
Well, what I'd like to see is virtually the entire country rising up in those demonstrations that we're beginning to see, and which are beginning to increase, where everybody gets up and says, God damn it, we're not gonna put up with this anymore, and if we have to, we're gonna overthrow you. And what that means is that Congress might be listening, the Supreme Court might be listening, and begin to worry about what's gonna happen if they don't act. So those are the kinds of things I'd like to see, but of course I can't make it happen. Maybe you can make it happen.
You've very well outlined and identified a long litany of threats that we all face. But I would posit that to millions of Americans who are not well educated and who are most concerned with keeping a roof over their head and food on the table, that all those threats are meaningless to them. they don't register in their lives. What can the Democrats and the rest of us do to get them to understand and make it relevant to them?
Well, as the vise closes and they begin to be squeezed and they begin to see that today it's someone else, tomorrow it's them.
I hope so.
Yeah, that may make the difference, but will it be in time? That's the question.
It seems to me that maybe the political system is what needs to, start functioning. And what I worry about is that the Democrats seem not to be well organized or not. The Democrats don't seem to know how to address this situation and to, forge a new unified policy that will attract people to vote in the next election if we have one. And I'm just wondering how we can get that process back on track.
Hey, I'm a good analyst and a good strategist, but I don't have an answer to that. They have to reach and communicate successfully with the people that have been mentioned that aren't responding right now. How you do that is, there are lots of theories right now, but some of them are pocketbook theories. I have this notion that when you present discussions like that, and they didn't do it, I think the Democrats in the last election go-around, you've got to tell the American story. And you've got to give significance to the kinds of things that you're discussing. So talking about the pocketbook and inflation and the price of eggs, you've got to make that, you've got to encompass that in something larger and more meaningful to all the people. And you've got to give civics lessons to some of the people that today don't understand what's going on. And maybe you need to make that as a condition of the right to vote. I don't know. I'm going to get myself into trouble with that one.
Well, I'm hoping that the tariffs will bite enough people that they will begin to think, that ain't what I voted for, let's overthrow this guy somehow. But, the tariffs look like they may begin to bite a lot of people that are ignoring everything right now.
Timing is of the essence. That bite has to come quickly, and it has to be recognized. My God, I've been bitten. I've been bitten. We're getting nibbled. They need a strong bite, and I think we're going to have one soon.
Barry, you've mentioned the constitutional view and some of the difficulties with it. What social mechanisms do you see that Trump is using in order to, for example, instill fear and use that mechanism to his advantage? And if you see such a mechanism, what's the weakness to it that the rest of us could address?
Well, it's pretty clear that he is using fear as an instrument of advancing his cause. You're having problems, he's saying, and it's their fault. They're going to ruin you. They're going to ruin this country. They're going to put you under. I can save you. So that's how he uses fear. And how you counteract that is by coming up with positive programs, I think, that tell people, we can give you something better than the nonsense that he offers. Now, exactly and precisely how you do that, I don't have the ability to suggest it. But I'd be interested in your views on that, because I know you're a deep thinker about exactly those things.
Given what you described, the unlimited possibilities that the Emergency Powers Clause provides, would it even change course if the Democrats were to win the House if there is a midterm election? Could Trump still use those emergency powers?
The unfortunate answer is yes. He will still have those emergency powers. Even if he allows the 2026 midterms to take place, and even if they overwhelmingly defeat the current Republican base that he has, he still has those emergency powers. And the worst part is that when you have a rat cornered, you know what the risk is. And he's a terrible threat. He's a terrible threat.
Somebody mentioned before about Trump not having a brain big enough to formulate this plot that's going on. Is the 2025 Republican manifesto, his outline that he's following now, is that the providing him with the next step and next step?
I think it did a very good job of outlining what's necessary for a takeover and the expectation that it can happen and how to do it. I think 2025, if you've been at the, maybe you were at the presentation the other day, on last Wednesday on 2025. Yeah, it lays it out pretty well.
Yeah, I looked through it. I've seen the article.
So it's, I'm reminded, as I'm listening to wonderful questions and ideas, that we are a very elite community here. There are many people who never vote. There are many people who probably struggle to read and understand the concepts. And I'm wondering, yes, we can demonstrate, we can wear our sandwich boards, we can do this, that, and the other thing, but we are still very elite. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts from, perhaps from history, that could inspire us to take a different course and be more effective.
Yeah, voting is not enough. Our responsibilities are much deeper than that. I think continuing to demonstrate and increase the numbers that are demonstrating is important. I think what may even be equally important is talking to your friends and relatives, particularly those that live in parts of the country where they're in swing districts. Talking to those and communicating the risk that we're under and the fact that we need them to take action, I think that multiplies. And hopefully there'll be a snowball effect, you know. That's what it'll take.
We hope.
You mentioned that the Army might be the ultimate resolution of this. Nations that have gone through that, they often find the military splitting into factions. And it gets really ugly, and I guess no matter what, it's going to be messy. Military people aren't allowed to obey an unlawful order. But who's to decide what's lawful if you got a commander-in-chief?
That's a conundrum. That's it.
Thank you, sir. I'm a guest of the actors today, and I'm so appreciative to be here. My question has to do with an incompetent president and what the Constitution says about removing it based on his incompetency.
Well, you had a major effort to do that. There are volumes of papers, that the Mueller report that had to do with attempting to remove not only an incompetent president, but a president who was regarded as colluding with Russians in the last election. And that was unsuccessful. That was unsuccessful. So it's hard to imagine that today it would happen unless they're faced with the threat of a turnover. They won't. The impeachment might succeed. In fact, it did succeed, but the Senate won't convict. And that's what you need, is Senate conviction to get a president out.
Excuse me, I hate to be a wet blanket, I usually am, but a week ago, there was a parade in Washington, D.C., and there were enormous numbers of demonstrations around the country. Out of curiosity, because this takes a lot of guts on my part, I watched Fox News to see how they handled all this. I periodically switch to that channel. I can't stand it very much to watch, but I did. My sacrifice for the cause. And
Sacrifices.
I watched it periodically, probably for about an hour. I mean, every few minutes I...
Glutton for punishment. You're a glutton for punishment.
Yes. The whole hour, as far as I could tell, except for commercials, was devoted to showing the parade. Nothing about the demonstrations. This is Fox News, which I understand is enormously influential with the Trump followers. The parade, I thought, was, even though I'm a veteran of the marching troops of the infantry, was one of the worst I've ever seen. I mean, it was a terrible show, but that's all they showed. So I took that to mean that the people who watch Fox News, and that's a huge proportion of the voters that vote for Trump, have no idea what's going on. They're unreachable. I presume there are other news sources that are similar. So I don't know what the answers are for this problem.
I think we should not spend a lot of time trying to convert the MAGA people.
No.
I think it's useless, but there are many more people who are in the middle, who are not quite believing in what the Democrats have to offer. Maybe some of them are former Republicans, maybe some of them are moderates, unregistered with a particular party. Those people can be reached. And there are enough of them to turn things around, but reaching those people should be our task, I think.
I don't imagine Fox News said anything about the soldiers who were marching out of step, did they?
That brings up something for me. My son told me that he just spent a couple of hours talking with his own son, my grandson, about what's going on with Iran and having to go back in history to take him through things that have led up to this point, because he hasn't learned all that stuff in school. And what he was dealing with was my grandson seeing all these bombs landing in Tehran on social media. And social media was, the people that he was watching on social media were just individuals in Tehran. They were not governments or journalists, they were just people who was trying to get away from the danger. And that makes me think that we don't know enough about
the use of social media and what maybe we could use to influence people in our own country. And that, you know, using Instagram and whatever other things they watch to try to get messages across might be more effective than parades.
You know, we have a group here called EPOC.
Yes, join up with us.
They're trying to do that very thing, trying to introduce us to the value and the possibilities of social media, and in fact producing some social media to do that. I have to tell you, I used to get all of my information from the New York Times and the Washington Post and so forth. I think I get a majority of my media now. My media is social media, and it surprises me. I mean, it just happened, it just gradually happened. So I think we need to pay a lot of attention to social media, and we're trying to. We're really trying to.
Okay, we're getting way over time, so one more.
Just to follow up on that, those of you who have never read the book, you need to read 1984, because that is exact replica of what is happening.
The microphone very close. Yeah.
That is exactly what is happening.
Yeah.
And the Ministry of Information, 1984, controls its population through the TV, what we call TV. And they can listen to you, what you're saying, and they create the images that you need to see. And to me, that seems like one pathway, or something that the Democrats or the people who want freedom should think about as a way of putting all their resources into communication systems before they get taken over by the South Africans who are in charge of all the data of this country and will be able to control your social security and your retirement.
Just one South African.
Well, there's Teal.
Oh, Teal too, yeah.
And they are right-wing racists.
Yeah.
Millions of dollars.
Old Nazis, you might call them. So if you could funnel vast amounts of money from the wealthy Democrats into a new kind of communication system that gets to the working class and the farming people, like Fox does, which is also run by Thomson Company, which is not an American company, the Thomson News people. So I think we're puppets here.
So his recommendation was reading 1984. I don't think everybody heard that.
Yeah, he was recommending reading 1984. It's not a fun read. Okay, well, thank you very much, Barry. Thank you.